Good morning, everybody. I just kind of take my time getting started, so let some people come in. Top of the morning. Okay, so forget it. They can catch up. All right, so PowerShell DSC, that's desired state configuration. That's what we're going to be working on for the next little while. But we're also going to be going over a couple of really easy things at the same time. So you're going to see here that there's a Windows Admin Center assignment worth 5%, auditing and security worth 5%. They're not worth much because they're really quite small. Okay, so these are teeny topics, really. Whereas PowerShell DSC is like 15% of your mark. So it's closer to a lab in terms of the amount of work that you have to put in. Okay. So because of that, it's not that you need a lot of time, but we do have we do have reading week here, the fall break. So I just decided, like I originally I had it due in a week's time, and I just decided, oh, I'll just put it out for one extra week, not for any particular reason. It just gives you a little bit of flexibility, you know. So it's a fair sized piece of work, but it's not that hard to wrap your head around. I think you could do it in a week pretty easily, but you know, I didn't. We'll see. You know, I'll be interested to know what people thought in terms of whether this was too much time. But let's get into what it is, and then we'll talk about the assessment that we're going to do. Okay. But all that to say is you have a few assignments which are going to be coming up here. So DSC will be due first, Windows Admin Center and auditing, those will be later, but they're actually the easiest ones to do. So you might hand them in quicker. I'm not sure. Okay, so let's get to the actual topic here. So like I said, this is a fair chunk. It's kind of at the same level of difficulty as I would say probably the secure apps assignment. And we have a single introductory exercise, which just, gets us used to how it works. And then I toss you into an assessment, which you'll have a couple of weeks to figure out. Okay. So today I'm just going to do this intro lecture. I'll show you the exercise. I'll also show you the assessment, but the assessment won't be due for a couple of weeks. Any questions before I get going about, anything outside of this topic? Just take a quick coffee sip here. Okay, and just to double check, everybody hear me okay? Yeah, that's what I like. Thank you. Okay, so, yep. Desired state configuration. You're gonna find it's I don't know, how do I put this? I like it, but I don't like it. It's a little bit. It's like everything Microsoft. It's useful, but it has quirks which are annoying. So you'll kind of see that as we go through this. One thing I've experienced is that I've actually kind of built my own uh, script. It's like a kind of a service which will push out and run scripts. And in order to configure systems and install software and stuff like that, and it's very similar to what they're doing here, except that their focus on it is a little different. Like I'm still running scripts. They're coming up with a different approach, but I've noticed that a lot of the problems they bumped into were problems that I bumped into. And so it's not just about DSC, it's actually the nature of pushing out configurations and pushing out scripts in the first place. Okay. So yeah, it is a little quirky, but that is kind of the nature of the beast. Yeah, kind of join again. uh, Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna say, well, you guys are recording it, right? Actually, don't tell me that. Don't answer that question. uh, try updating Teams. Okay, so um, yeah, that was helpful. Although very similar to mine. So, okay, so what is DSC all about? This is, managing compliance with PowerShell. The term that gets used a lot is drift. Okay, the idea being that if you have a lot of machines or servers specifically that you're taking care of, over time people make changes to them to troubleshoot issues, to bypass a problem temporarily, and often they'll forget to restore it to the state that it's intended to be in, right? And so over time, your servers start to drift away from the configuration that they're supposed to have. Now, the idea with DSC is that you're using PowerShell to establish a kind of a standard for how you want your systems to be configured. And you can run DSC against it, it will test it, it'll tell you whether it passes or not. And you can also do enforcement where you say, yeah, go and fix it. Okay. So all of that requires a certain amount of infrastructure that you've got to figure out and manage. Like there's uh, complications to it. So we're going to look at how you could do this with PowerShell DSC, how you can automate and enforce basic configurations, and that's all we're going to stick to is fairly basic things. Okay, you can go pretty deep with this, but I just want to give you a taste of what it's like. The concept of push versus pull, like if you look at WSIS or group policy, that's a pull technology, right? Where the clients go and fetch their configurations periodically, right? On the other hand, you can also have a push model where some central server is actually telling everybody what to do and having to connect into them to get it to do it. DSC has supported both in the past, although I think Microsoft is moving away from that. And then there's enforcing compliance, which is really just, it's there's the testing versus the actual go and fix it, right? And then the testing is the gathering of information on configuration drift. So you could use this to get reporting on how much drift you have in your organization without actually doing anything to fix it if you're worried that that might break something, right? But you could also use it to go and remediate any kind of problems that you have. But you got to make sure that you've tested that pretty well at that point. Okay, so DSC stands for Desired State Configuration. This is built into PowerShell by default. It's not something that you have to add into it. It's already there. But there are various modules that you're likely to want to add in on top of that. Okay. So it's a framework, which is there, but then you want to plug in modules to it. Okay. And the goal here is instead of writing code that executes a series of tasks, you're actually kind of writing config files. Okay. Which determine, they basically state this is how I want my system. These are the characteristics I want it to have. And then the modules that you call on will do all of that work for you. Okay. So you're not reinventing the wheel by having to recode a bunch of things that somebody's already done before. All you have to do is create the configuration file that instructs which modules should be called on and what settings you want to have in place. Okay. So the main difference between DSC and a typical PowerShell command or script is DSC just specifies the end state. There's no, you don't have to get into the nuts and bolts of how it's done. Okay. Unless you create your own modules, in which case you're participating in the larger process. Okay. So what you're typically calling on are resources and providers that you can plug into DSC in order to achieve your goals. So in your config file, you'll import these modules, and then you'll use some of the definitions in them to state what you want. Okay. So it's usually in the form of PowerShell modules. And you can change these as needed. So, there are previous versions of this topic in this an exercise, and I've used other modules in the past that served the same function. Okay, it's just somebody else wrote a different one, and it happened to be better. In fact, Microsoft has written multiple modules to serve the same function as they've kind of learned what works better over time. Okay. And the idea here is that you can just take those modules out of your config script, put in the new ones, change your config file a little bit, and then everything will either work the same or it'll work better, depending on whether there were some bugs or what have you. So we're going to look at one example of a bug that actually did show up in one of the modules, just so you could see how you can troubleshoot some of the issues. Okay. Okay, so DSC makes use of config files to specify how a host should be configured, and the config files are declarative rather than imperative. So what does that mean? It means something along the lines of there should be, just using language instead of like, the proper syntax, but there should be a file named this on the system with these permissions, you know? So you just state that wish or that desire, and the module will actually execute it and carry it out. Okay. So the purpose of the config file is to just declare the end state that you want, and then you don't write the script. The module does. The modules do all the work for you. Okay. So you just have to be careful about your config file. Now, the config file may have multiple entries in it. It should do probably, and it may matter what order each of those things occur in. Okay, so if you think of like, let's say, deploying applications in MDT. Okay, that has nothing to do with DSC, but when you're deploying applications, sometimes it matters the order in which you deploy them, right? And so it's up to you as the deployer to kind of put them in the correct order and maybe set up dependencies, right? And say, well, we need this to be installed, but for this to be installed, we need this other thing to be installed, so we'll list it as a dependency, right? You got to do the same thing with your config file. So if I want to have a certain folder in place with certain permissions, and I want there to be a share associated with it, I can't do the share until the folder's in place, right? And so the folder being in place is a dependency. Basically, it's a dependency of having that share. Okay, I can't have the share without that folder. Excuse me. So, you have to think through your process essentially. But beyond that, this actually saves you a lot of trouble. So what this typically involves is identifying a machine by its name in the config file, okay? And then having sections of the config file, uh, what we call a node block, okay? So each node block applies to a particular machine. Within that, you'll have a series of definitions which state, this is what I want for this machine, okay? So let's just look at an example here. Here's a sample config file. This is the simplest one possible, really. And I'll go into a little bit of detail here in a second, but you got hello world, right? So that's the name of essentially your configuration, okay? Configuration is a special word in PowerShell. And then, you got your chicken lips to actually encapsulate everything. So everything within that is going to be your configuration. You've got to always have this line: import DSC resource, module name, PS desired state configuration. That already exists in PowerShell, that module. You just have to call on it to say that you want to make use of the features. Okay. After you've done that, now you may have a series of imports that you do here, but this one always has to be present. Okay. After that, you want to have your node block. So here we're defining a node called localhost. Okay. Which, as you know, every machine calls itself localhost. So what that means is that if I run this on a machine, no matter what the machine's name, it's going to say, oh, that's me, right? Because I'm localhost. And so then it'll run this set of configurations. Underneath that, I have a file section, which I call hello world. So that's just the name of it. But this is the object type essentially. So I want a file to exist, and my instruction is called hello world. And I'm saying I want it to exist here. Okay. I want to make sure that it exists rather than doesn't exist. So you could actually delete files this way as well. Okay. So I could say ensure absent, right? And then I don't know if it's absent. I can't quite remember, but I'm guessing it's absent. And then it would actually go in and say, oh, this hello world file is here. I'm going to delete it, right? But we want to make sure that it's there. And then we can actually provide content for the file. Okay. And so this is about as simple as you can get. Um, now, once you have that config file, you have to compile it into something called a MOF, okay? Which is a really old school thing going back to Windows NT. So it's called a managed object format. It's kind of been in the background of Windows the whole time, and it's associated with WMI. Okay, so this is not new technology. They're just leveraging stuff that's been around for a while. So WMI is basically a way for querying your system for information, and also sometimes initiating changes. But it has a long, long history. Okay, and it's kind of done in a standardized way. So if you ever use WMIC, which we've used before, that's plugging into WMI and getting details about your system as well, right? So this MOF standard is just associated with all of that stuff from back then. And Microsoft just decided to recycle it. So this way of framing information, this MOF standard, used by WMI and DSC, follows the SIM standard, which is not something that Microsoft created, but you don't need to know all these details too much. Okay, like don't worry about it too much. But all of these are related. So MOF, WMI, SIM, they're all kind of part of the same family of information management. Okay. So the MOF file that gets created when you compile this, it basically just contains all the SIM classes that are needed in order to interact with SIM and WMI. Okay, so when we're doing a compilation, I'm just going to go back to that script. So we're taking this PS1 file, which has this content in it, and what we're going to do is we're going to dot compile it. That's what they call it. Okay, and the reason is you put this dot in here, and then you provide the path to the script. Okay, and it will turn that into a MOF file. Okay, so it's going to create a directory named after the script. So here we've got C scripts hello world, and within hello world, the folder, we're going to have our localhost.mof, and that localhost name is coming from this node block here. Okay. So if I have multiple node blocks, then I'll get multiple MOF files, one for each node block. Okay. But in this case, we get localhost.mof. Oops. Now, once you have that MOF, then you can use that to get PowerShell to call on it to actually verify all the commands or all the end states that you want. Okay. Just one moment here. Okay, that's better. Okay, so configurations can be implemented through either a push or pull deployment models. And actually, like you could actually have the clients periodically dial back. That would be the pull model, right? The push model, you're going through a central server. You're probably PS remoting in or something like that, and you're calling it from this central resource, and it's going to go to each machine and verify it one at a time. Okay, or as a batch process of some type. So the push model is centralized. The pull model is decentralized. I can't remember which one. I think Microsoft has deprecated the pull model, if I remember correctly. One of the two has been deprecated, but they're still supported right now. Like you can do them, but they're moving away from one of them. Okay. Now, with these DSC declarations, the client checks for a configuration. It corrects any deviations if you've told it to, um, when needed. So, if everything's satisfied, it'll just come back and say, you're good. Okay. So it's not gonna redo things that are already done. But if it sees a problem, it'll correct it. Okay. And so you can run DSC as many times as you like, and it's just going to check the desired state, correct any errors. One thing I've noticed, which is a little janky in my opinion, is it really has to do with the way that people set up their config files, but it can happen if you haven't set up the dependencies quite right. You may have to run DSC multiple times on the same host, because it might fix, say you've got 5 problems, it might fix 2 of them right away, and then it can't fix the other 3 unless you run it again. Okay. Usually that just means that your dependencies aren't set up quite right. Okay. But if that's the case, then you just rerun it and it usually can fix it up. So there could be an iterative, test it, it's failing, run it, test it again, it's still failing, but it's better, run it again. And push and pull techniques, they can be applied in combination, so you don't have to choose one or the other. So you can push out configuration changes if you need to, and most of the time you can rely on pull techniques if you're not in a rush. You know, reporting is also supported. So in other words, you can tell it just to gather information and tell us what's broken without actually doing anything about it. Okay. Now, this is where it gets into the weeds a little bit. The way that this is all implemented is through a service running on the client system called the local configuration manager. So you'll often just see it referred to as the LCM. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing a push or a pull, the LCM is always involved. Okay. And its job is to go and enforce all of these desired states, right? So you could configure it to push or pull. It doesn't really matter. It's still the same service. It's running as a local system. Okay. Now, the fact that it's running as local system has consequences for how you get files and data off of a server onto your system. Okay. It does impact the way that your workflow essentially. Okay. So you could set up things called repositories, which are just locations where files can be copied from a server for use by the LCM, okay, on any particular machine. So the LCM will go and fetch these and use them to do the configurations. So for example, we said that in that hello world.txt file had to exist, had to have this content. Another approach I could have done was to say, there's this file called hello world.txt up on this server, go and pull it down and put it in this location. Okay. Now, what that would mean is that I'd be calling on a repository. There's 2 types of repositories that you can have. You can either have an IIS server or some kind of web server, uh, or you could have a Samba share, a Windows share. Now, both of those have their own complications associated with them. If you're using a Samba share, you have to have an identity, right? And so, to access that share, you don't necessarily want everybody to have access to it. But the question is, who is the local configuration manager as a service running as? Well, it's running as local system. How would that show up when it's authenticating to Samba? And the answer is that it would show up as the computer object in a domain. Okay. So if you're granting access to the LCM to go and get data off of a Samba share, you have to grant access to the computer object in Active Directory. Okay. It's the one that has to have permissions. It's not running as you, it's running as the computer. Okay. On the other hand, if you're using IIS, there you don't have to set up um, any kind of permissions, but then you've got a bit of a security issue potentially, right? So another thing that you can do is set up certificates for the local machine. We're not going to get into that. because I think we've done enough certificates so far. But you could set up certificates for each machine in your environment, and then it could use certs to authenticate to a web server, right? That can also work. Now, there is a community of people who are working on DSC resources and modules. So you could just grab some that allow you to deploy these configurations on a server instead of having to do it yourself. Okay, that could be kind of handy. But we're not really going to go that deep. Okay, we will grab some data off of a share, but it's not going to be too fancy. Okay, so here's a sample push. Okay, so let's just go back. Last we did, we had this hello world, right? We dot compiled it into a MOF, and so it resides under this folder here, right? Localhost.mof. And now what we want to do is actually execute that. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to execute it on our own current machine, okay? It doesn't have to be that way. You can actually execute it against a remote machine, but we're starting out basic here, okay? So you run the script on the target localhost and check the results. And something to notice here is that it's not always the best idea to use localhost as your node name, because that means that anywhere you run it, it's going to run, right? And so if somebody accidentally runs it, and every machine will say, oh, yeah, this applies to me, right? So it is kind of a nuclear option. It's better to use the host name explicitly so that you're targeting, right? But there are circumstances where you do want a configuration to apply to everybody, in which case that's fair use, right? So what we're going to do here is just start it on the machine that we're currently logged in at. So you start -DSC configuration, specify the path to the folder, right? You don't need to specify the MOF file, you just give the folder. And here what we're saying is, I want you to give me detailed information about what's happening. And I don't want you to run this in the background. I want you to um, occupy, the command prompt until you're done. Okay, which can be useful because if you don't do that, it'll go into the background, and then if you're running a script, the next line of the script is going to run, and so that could be a timing issue, right? So sometimes you want to use -wait, sometimes you don't. Verbose gives you extra information when you're troubleshooting, right? So we start that configuration, and then after, when it's actually terminated, when it's actually released the command prompt, we can then run a test DSC configuration. So a start DSC configuration will go and put it into the state that we want, okay? The test DSC configuration gives us a Boolean answer, yes or no, whether the system is now in a proper state, okay? So here, it's saying, when we do the test configuration, it's saying, yes, it's true. We do have this file hello world.txt. Oops. And here's the content of it. Okay. Okay, now there's a few different DSC related commands that you can use. The get help command, and if you just specify -DSC, it'll give you basically the default DSC commands that you can call on. Okay. Um, Now, beyond that, that doesn't talk about modules or anything like that. Okay, but you can see there's start DSC configuration test. We don't use a lot of the other ones necessarily, but you can in a pinch. And so this is a reference for you to check them out. Okay. In terms of modules, you can here, this is not complete, but you can run the find module command, and you could say anything. I want to find modules related to the DSC resource kit. The DSC resource kit isn't everything. That's just some of them, okay? But this will give you a starting point for some of the different modules that you can work with, okay? Usually, if there's an X in front, that indicates that Microsoft was the one that created it, okay? They've created other ones as well, but if it has an X, then they're the ones behind it, typically, if it has an X at the start, okay? There are other members of the community that can publish their own resources as well. But anything in the DSC resource kit is typically Microsoft provided. And you can see there's different modules for configuring networking. You can actually configure certificates, right? You notice that there's a networking DSC and an X networking. So one of those is newer than the other. They each have their own little wrinkles, and they have features which may be better. So you could use one or the other, and often I'll have people doing that. Like different people will choose networking DSC versus X networking, and they'll still get it done, you know? It's just a matter of what you come to use, what you become aware of, and what you like, you know? But usually the X ones, I think, are older, and I think the DSC ones are newer. I can't quite remember. I'd have to check into that a little more. I've just kind of forgotten, you know, but definitely one is a new generation versus another. Okay. So here's an example of some things you can do with DSC. Just it's incomplete, but it just gives you a bit of an idea. I can create a share. I can create a website. I can create files in certain locations. I can turn off Internet Explorer Enhanced Security. I can enable remote desktop. I can perform Windows updates. I can manage Hyper-V, okay, and the settings around the server. I can manage DNS. I can manage PowerShell packages and install modules. Okay. Um, I could set up BitLocker. I can manage Chrome and Firefox. There are modules for those. I haven't really played with those, but you can do printer management, uh, you know, if you have to. SQL management and antivirus config. I'm assuming this is specific to the Windows antivirus rather than a third party, right? But just to give you a taste of the wide scope of things that you can do with this. Okay. Now, is this the only game in town? Printers mentioned. Yeah, exactly. You know, you'll notice that we never really teach printers all that much, which we should actually. But um, printers are a bane of existence. Really, it's like I think all of us, any of us who have done tech work, we go into teaching, we're like, I don't want to talk about printers. They are a bit of a pain. So, okay, so competition. Yeah, DSC is not the only game in town. However, it does come into many of the solutions that it competes with. So, you know, we've got things like Puppet, Chef, and Ansible. All of those are different types of automation tools. Okay. Ansible is one that's very common on Windows, but Ansible actually plugs in, it can take DSC and leverage it on Windows systems. Okay. So Ansible also works on Linux systems, let's say. But if you're dealing with Windows, then Ansible is often calling on DSC under the hood. Okay. And not only that, but you could call on it explicitly through Ansible if you want to. And so I kind of see DSC as a stepping stone into these more, uh, slightly more robust features. I think DSC is a little more awkward at certain times, and then Ansible will wrap that up in a configuration management structure, which is a little nicer to work with, you know. But under the hood, there's still quite a lot of DSC that could be going on. So you might deploy applications, you know, using Ansible, and then the OS configurations, you'll still use Ansible, but you'll call on DSC to set those configuration options. You know, that's quite common. Now, another thing is DSC is great for interacting with Hyper-V. Okay, so you combine Hyper-V with DSC, you can automate the deployment of a new server from beginning to end. So you could say, you know, end state is I want this VM to exist on this server, and you know, then I want to run DSC against that new virtual machine, and I want it to have these properties, right? And so you can configure a deployment of a whole bunch of different virtual machines. And I've actually seen Microsoft do this. If you look at some of their Azure Stack HCI solutions, you know, I've tried installing them and playing with them a bit, and you could see DSC running, setting things up. Okay. Now, The Hyper-V scripts, you can use those to provision the VM resource, rename the system, join the domain, all that kind of stuff. And then you don't need thick images, right? And so that can make it a little lighter for setting everything up in your environment. That's what they call infrastructure as code, okay? Where you're just providing all of this code information and it just gets set up for you, okay? Just based on your specifications. So you maintain this library of config files that put the VMs in the desired state, but you're not actually storing a lot until you're actually running it. Okay. Now this actually carries over to Azure, and I didn't realize it at the time when I first created these, but when I created this set of slides, but DSC it integrates with Azure as well. More than that, Microsoft is kind of de-emphasizing DSC locally, but they're putting all of their DSC resources into Azure now. And so I think it's called Azure Automate, if I remember correctly. But I can't quite remember for sure. But the idea is, where before they were like, oh, let's create DSC so people can manage their servers, they've taken what they've worked on there and they're kind of emphasizing the cloud a lot more. Obviously, because they want to make money off of it that way, right? But the idea here is that there is some talk about certain aspects of DSC being deprecated, but that's really indicating a change of focus, not an abandonment of the project itself. They're really gearing it more towards cloud use. And so what we're going to learn here, we're going to be able to leverage as you go into the cloud. You can start seeing how Azure Automate kind of serves the same function and is going to be the next generation going forward, you know. Now, currently in Azure, and we're going to see that as well in a future exercise, most server templates, you deploy them through the use of JSON configuration files. Okay. So you populate a JSON file, and it gives all the specifications about the hardware of the server that you're going to deploy, and then it'll automatically create it for you. Okay, you just run a job and then it gets made. Okay, so this is a provisioning of a VM. You can provision the resources using this JSON config, and then you can use DSC to actually set up the server that results from it. Okay, and so I think that's what they're doing with Azure Automate essentially. Now that might be a little behind the scenes. You may not have as much access. You might be dealing with an interface more. But that is where the technology is going. Okay. I haven't looked at it enough yet, so I don't want to go too deep into that because I'd be speculating a lot. But a benefit that DSC can enjoy in Azure is the use, I do know this, is the use of the key vault. So authentication and the storing of passwords is a bit of a concern in your local area network. However, in Azure, there's a secure location called the key vault, which your tenant will have. Okay, and you can store all your authentication information there, and DSC can actually access that in order to authenticate. It solves the problem which we have in the local area network. Okay, with DSC on premises, authentication information is a little trickier, and I've struggled with this a little bit myself in trying to set up certain solutions. Okay, so Key Vault is a nice little feature. However, cloud only, right? Now, there's some nice little resources here if you're interested. Um, but when we get to the actual exercise and the assignment, I have other links that aren't just this. This is more higher level. Okay. There's more nuts and bolts ones that'll come in the exercise. So any questions about the broad concept of DSC? I'll do a little Elmo waving of the arms. Broad concept. All right. So let's take a look at this exercise. There's a little, actually, maybe I think I have it here. Hold on a second. Where did it go? I guess I don't have it here. I just want it a little bigger. That's a little too small. Okay, so what you need, a DC, a new member server, which we're just going to use as a scratch kind of, uh, you know, a testing server essentially, and your default gateway. Okay. So what we're going to do, if you open this and you enable editing, then you can double click into these zones and you can get access to copy and paste. Okay. So don't feel like you have to type it all out. You can actually just get in there. Just make sure that it's not read only. Okay. But we're going to create an example share, just a proof of concept that this can be done. So we're going to import the desired state configuration, but we're also going to import something called xsamba share. Okay. And we're going to apply a local host name to it, but then later on, we're going to go and clean that up a little bit. Okay. So we have to go through a few gymnastics to make sure that NuGet is installed and all that kind of stuff, or Nugget. Uh, and we'll do a little bit of testing, and then we're going to bump into a problem. Okay, so I won't really go into the details of it right now, but we're actually going to get a share. But when we actually run testing, it's not gonna say that it succeeded. Okay, it's going to say it failed, even though when we inspect everything, it looks good. And then I'm going to go in down a rabbit hole and just kind of figure out why it is that this is giving this bad information. And the reason I'm doing that, I'm not going to go into it in detail here, but the reason I'm doing it is so that you can see how you can troubleshoot issues, look at log files when you're dealing with a DSC problem. Okay. In the end, we resolve the issue, we fix it, where it actually comes back and says in a test that it's in the desired state. Okay. And we also make a couple of changes where instead of going on a node localhost, we're actually going to specify the proper name of the system that we're going to run it against. Okay. So that's going to be our intro. And I strongly suggest you do that before you jump into the actual assessment. Okay. So it's not that big. I think it's about 12 pages or something like that. Let me just see. Yeah, it's about 12 pages. Uh, you'll do that pretty quick. Okay. The next thing that we get to is the actual assessment. Now, I'm just going to point this out. I mentioned before you have 2 weeks to do it. It's already open. Okay. So you want to go to this PowerShell DSC assignment. You want to pull down both this Word doc and this zip file. Okay. And then we're just going to look at what it is that I'm going to ask you to do. So we've done a proof of concept by this time. A proof of concept, uh, share, right? But now I'm going to ask you to do some research where you got a couple of weeks, and I want you to come up with a config file for a server that's going to do all of the following. Okay, so there's the host name. I think what I said is steps 3 to 10 should be configured by DSC. So the first two you can do manually. Okay. So the host name should be 2515 dash your initials, whatever those are. So I'm just using MS, right? You don't have to set that up in DSC because you need a machine name. You should run your DSC configuration. That also can be manual, obviously. And the idea here is we want to run this off of your DC and we want to apply it to a remote machine. Okay. So your script should handle any kind of remote installation details. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there may be modules that you need to install on the remote VM in order for any of this to function. Okay. Um, Now your script should handle the remote installation of any DSC modules, but it doesn't have to do it through DSC. Those module installations can be run through an invoke command, for example. Okay. After that, everything else that you do here should be done using DSC. So the remote system, the one that we've named after your initials here, it should have IIS installed through DSC. Okay. And it should have the default website up and running. It should have a share. that grants domain administrators full control at the share level. So that's kind of a review of the exercise that we do. Okay. The share should be named repo and should be based at a CINet pub repo. Okay. No other users should have access to it. So I shouldn't be able to browse there, right? The file's provided in repo.zip, so that's one of the things you download with this assessment. Should be present and browsable in the repo virtual directory. So I should be able to visit your server /repo, and I should see content. Okay. Now, I want you to create a virtual directory called repo. Again, through DSC. Based on the folder CINet pub repo. So that same folder should correspond to a virtual directory. Okay. I want you to enable HTTP and disable HTTPS in IIS. So I only want it to serve out HTTP. Okay. A remote desktop should be enabled on the VM as a configuration. Now, I could have chosen HTTPS, by the way. I just didn't want to because I figure we've done enough certificates at this point. And that would be a whole other level of DSC configuration. So I'm just going to say, keep it HTTP. We're going to keep it simple. The VM's firewall should be configured with 3 different rules: HTTP, HTTPS, and RDP, right? So HTTP allows port 80 through, RDP allows 3389 through, and HTTPS will block 443. Okay. And then I want Internet Enhanced Security Configuration, Internet Explorer Enhanced Security Configuration. I want that to be disabled for administrators. I don't care about users. You could disable it for them or just leave it as it is. Doesn't really matter. Okay, so long as it works for administrator. And then what I want you to do over the next 2 weeks is get that configuration going on a test VM that you set up. Okay. But then on the day, 2 weeks from today, so on the 14th of November, uh, in class, I'm going to give you a VM. So I'll have you download it. You're going to boot it up, and you're going to have to apply that config that you've been working on for the past 2 weeks to that VM. There's no tricks involved in it. It's just that it's going to be a VM that's outside of your control. So you're going to have a 2-hour period to make sure that any kind of weirdness that you have to deal with is dealt with. Okay, so if you built in a bunch of stuff into your own VM that it's not actually automated, then you're going to bump into a problem when you actually come to deal with this fresh VM, right? So what I want you to do is test your configuration thoroughly. Make sure that you have no configurations on your VM so that when you come across a brand new one, it should be able to handle it all. Okay. So on your DC during the quiz, so that's on the 14th, that's some time away. When you're ready, you take a full screenshot of the output of your run of Start DSC configuration with verbose, force, and weight as switches applied. So that's going to show everything. And then take a screenshot of a test configuration. Okay, so 2 separate screenshots there. And then I have a script that I want you to run. What it's going to do is it's going to gather a bunch of information. Okay, and then it's going to undo a bunch of the configurations that are done here. Okay, so it's going to randomly choose some of the things to undo. And then I want you to run that test again. And it should fail the test at this point because I messed around with your config. Okay. So I want to see that it can detect those changes. So we're going to be running test DSC configuration twice. Once to prove that it worked, and once to prove that we've drifted successfully. We've actually drifted. Okay. Then you'll have that folder, which will be on the root of the C drive. You take your screenshots, dump them all in there, dump your script in there, and then I'll do a correction of it. Okay, so we got 2 weeks for that. This is out of 10. This is how you're evaluated. It's worth 15%, but there's 10 points that I'm checking. Okay, so here's the rubric. And these are some useful help files. So do check them out. They'll give you some handy guidance on doing things like opening firewall ports, etc. Okay, this is rather targeted. I talk about Internet Explorer and IE, ESC, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is a big research one, just so you know, and you'll kind of be curating it and kind of fixing it up as we go. Any questions? Cuestiones. Okay, have a good time. So I'll let you go, and I'm going to enjoy my coffee and some oranges. If you guys need anything, I'll still be around. If questions occur to you in 20 minutes, I'll still be here. Okay.